Lila was a quiet little girl who had just moved to a new town with her mother. Everything felt strange to her. The new school, the new faces, and the endless noise she couldn't hear. Lila was born deaf, but she had learned to understand people through their lips, expressions, and vibrations. She couldn't hear music, but she loved to feel it. Every time her mother played the old piano at home, Lila would rest her hands on the wooden surface and smile as the deep hums and soft trembles ran through her fingers. When she joined her new school, her mother had one wish, that Lila wouldn't feel different. So she enrolled her in all the regular classes, including music. The thought of going to a music class made Lila nervous, but also a little excited. She loved pianos. She had always dreamed of sitting in front of one, pressing the shiny black and white keys herself. On her first day, Lila walked into the music room holding a small notebook and a pencil. That was how she talked to people. The moment she entered, the room filled with the low murmur of curious voices. Some students stopped what they were doing and stared. A few whispered to each other, wondering who she was. The music teacher, Mrs. Carter, smiled warmly. "Welcome, Lila," she said slowly, making sure her lips moved clearly so Lila could read them. Lila nodded shyly and smiled back. The classroom was bright, sunlight pouring through tall windows, lighting up the grand piano in the corner. Lila's eyes instantly went there. It looked even more beautiful than she had imagined. Polished, strong, and silent until someone brought it to life. Mrs. Carter noticed her gaze and said kindly, "You like the piano?" Lila quickly wrote in her notebook, "Yes, very much." The teacher read it and smiled. "Then maybe one day you'll play for us." Some students laughed softly at that. Lila noticed but didn't say anything. She just sat at her desk and pulled out her music book. She couldn't read the notes perfectly yet, but she loved how they looked. Tiny symbols that created something so magical. As the class went on, Mrs. Carter introduced a few students. There was Sarah, who played the violin, Tom on the drums, and Ethan, the most confident student in the class, who played the piano. Ethan was popular and proud. He often played during school events and everyone admired him. When Lila saw him sit down at the piano, her eyes followed every move he made. His fingers danced across the keys with ease. The sound, though she couldn't hear it, seemed to fill the room like light. She could see the way others reacted, smiling, tapping, swaying slightly. It was beautiful to watch, but when Ethan finished and saw Lila looking at him, he frowned slightly. He had overheard some of the other students whispering that the new girl couldn't hear. He didn't understand how someone like her could enjoy a music class. He thought it was strange. After class, Mrs. Carter asked the students to introduce themselves to Lila. Some came forward and waved or wrote short greetings in her notebook. "Hi, I'm Sarah," one girl wrote. "Nice to meet you," Lila replied, her handwriting small and neat. But Ethan stayed behind, leaning against the piano, watching her curiously. As Lila packed her bag, she felt his eyes on her. She turned slightly and gave a small smile, hoping to be friendly. But Ethan only asked, "Do you even understand what we're doing in this class?" His tone wasn't cruel, just confused, but it made her freeze. She quickly looked down and wrote, "I can feel music." Ethan blinked, not sure what that meant. He was about to ask again, but Mrs. Carter entered the room, and Lila quietly walked out. That night at home, Lila sat by the window thinking about the day. It had been hard, the whispers, the looks, the way Ethan had spoken to her. But she also felt something new and determination. She wanted to show them that she did belong there, that even without hearing she could still understand music in her own way. She went to the old piano her mother kept in the living room, placed her small hands on the keys and began pressing them slowly. The soft vibrations rose through her palms into her arms and filled her chest like a heartbeat. She smiled. This was her world, quiet, but full of feeling. The next day, when she entered the classroom again, she felt a little stronger. She waved at Mrs. Carter, who greeted her warmly and took her seat near the piano. As Ethan played another piece, Lila didn't just watch. She closed her eyes and pressed her fingertips lightly on the wooden surface beside the keys, feeling every rise and fall of the notes. When the song ended, she opened her eyes and clapped softly, though she couldn't hear herself doing it. Mrs. Carter noticed her effort and smiled. Ethan saw it too, but didn't understand why she seemed so calm, so sure, even though she couldn't hear a single sound. Lila's journey had just begun. The class saw her as a quiet, different girl, but soon they would see something far more powerful, that sometimes the people who live in silence can feel the deepest kind of music. And though Lila didn't know it yet, this was only the start of the moment that would change everyone's hearts, including Ethan's. The next day, the music room was buzzing with excitement. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and new sheet music. Students gathered around the piano laughing and chatting. Lila quietly entered, holding her small notebook close to her chest. She smiled shyly at Mrs. Carter, who gave her an encouraging nod. Ethan was already sitting at the piano, showing off a new tune he had learned. His fingers flew across the keys and the room filled with admiration. The students clapped as he finished. Ethan smiled proudly. He loved the attention. But when he noticed Lila standing near the back watching him intently, something in his chest stirred, a mix of curiosity and pride. He tilted his head and said loudly, "Hey, do you even understand what I'm playing?" The room went quiet for a second. Some students looked awkwardly at Lila, waiting for her to respond. She blinked, not fully catching what he had said, and tilted her head slightly. Mrs. Carter frowned. "Ethan," she warned softly. But Ethan grinned, not realizing the weight of his words. He repeated slower this time, exaggerating his lips so she could read them. "Can you even play piano if you can't hear it?" Laughter rippled through the class. Some tried to hide it behind their hands, others looked at Lila with pity. She stood still, her face pale, her heart thumping fast. For a moment she didn't move. Then she gave a small, trembling smile, not of joy but of quiet courage. She took her notebook and wrote something. Slowly she walked up to Ethan, who was still sitting at the piano, smirking slightly. She held the notebook toward him. On the page, in neat handwriting, were 4 simple words: "Music speaks without sound." Ethan stared at it. For a moment his grin faded, but pride wouldn't let him show weakness. "Yeah, sure," he said under his breath, shrugging. "We'll see about that." Mrs. Carter gently placed a hand on Lila's shoulder. "That's enough for today," she said firmly. But Lila only nodded and walked to her seat, pretending not to notice the whispers that followed. She sat down, opened her music book, and stared at the notes, black dots and lines swimming before her eyes. She felt the sting of humiliation, but beneath it was something else: determination. A small fire lit inside her chest. If they thought she couldn't play, she would show them. She would make them feel what she felt. After class, when everyone had left, Lila stayed behind. The room was silent now, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Dust floated in the light like tiny stars. She walked slowly to the piano, the same one Ethan had used to mock her. She sat down and placed her small hands on the cool keys. Then she took off her shoes and set her bare feet on the wooden floor. She pressed one key, and soft, low, gentle. She couldn't hear it, but she could feel it. The vibration ran up through the piano, through her hands, through her heart. She closed her eyes and began pressing more keys, one after another, creating a rhythm she could feel deep inside. Behind her, the door opened quietly. Mrs. Carter stood there, unnoticed. She watched Lila play, not with sound but with soul. The teacher felt a lump rise in her throat. Each movement of Lila's hands was filled with emotion, gentle, patient, full of love. It wasn't just music. It was courage turned into melody. When Lila finally stopped, she looked up and saw Mrs. Carter watching. She smiled shyly, embarrassed to be caught. But Mrs. Carter wiped her eyes and said softly, "Lila, that was beautiful." Lila quickly wrote in her notebook, "I can feel when it's right." "Yes," Mrs. Carter said with a proud smile, "you truly can." The next day, Ethan came in and Mrs. Carter asked Lila if she wanted to show the class what she could do. Lila's eyes widened, but she nodded. Ethan folded his arms and leaned against the wall, smirking again. "This I gotta see," he muttered, but Lila didn't play that day. She just walked to the piano, touched it gently, and smiled. She wasn't ready, not yet. She would wait for the right moment, the right feeling, and she would surprise them all. As the days passed, Ethan began to notice small things. Lila never looked upset, no matter what people said. She sat close to the piano during every class, feeling it hum when others played. Once, he saw her helping another student find the right note by pressing the key and nodding when the vibration felt strong. He couldn't understand it. How could someone who couldn't hear care so much about sound? Sometimes he caught himself watching her and a quiet guilt began to grow inside. Him. But he pushed it away with a laugh and went back to his usual confident self. Then came the day that would change everything. Mrs. Carter announced a small in-class recital. "Each of you will perform something next week," she said cheerfully. "It can be solo or with a partner." Ethan immediately volunteered. "I'll play first," he said as usual. But to everyone's surprise, Lila raised her hand too. Mrs. Carter smiled warmly. "Wonderful, Lila. Would you like to play the piano?" Lila nodded. The class went silent. Ethan's mouth opened slightly in disbelief. "Wait, you mean she's actually going to play?" he blurted. Mrs. Carter gave him a sharp look, but Lila just smiled softly and wrote a single line in her notebook. "You'll feel it too." No one knew what she meant, but the spark in her eyes said everything. The mockery that started as laughter was about to become the beginning of something unforgettable. After that day, the school seemed quieter to Lila, or maybe it was just her heart that had grown calm after all the whispers and laughter. She didn't care what the others thought anymore. She had a goal now. She wanted to play the piano, not to prove anything, but to show what she felt. Every afternoon when classes ended and the hallways emptied, Lila would sneak back into the music room. The sun would be low by then, painting the wooden floors with soft orange light. The room smelled faintly of dust, paper, and old instruments. It was peaceful, her own secret world where no one judged her, no one laughed. She would sit at the piano, take a deep breath, and close her eyes. Her fingers would touch the cool keys like she was greeting an old friend. Then she'd press one gently. The vibration was faint, but she could feel it travel through her fingertips into her wrists up to her heart. She pressed another and another. Each note made the piano speak to her, not in sound but in feeling. One evening, as she practiced, she slipped off her shoes and placed her bare feet on the wooden floor. The deep notes of the piano sent tiny trembles through the ground. She smiled. It was like the piano was talking directly to her, whispering secrets through the wood and air. Sometimes, she would place one hand on the side of the piano and play with the other, feeling how the vibrations changed when she hit higher or lower notes. She could tell when something sounded wrong, not because she heard it, but because the vibration didn't feel right. The harmony she created came from her body's memory, not her ears. Mrs. Carter, the teacher, had noticed Lila staying late almost every day. One afternoon, she quietly opened the classroom door and peeked inside. What she saw took her breath away. Lila was sitting at the piano with her eyes closed, her small fingers moving gracefully across the keys. The sunset behind her made her hair glow like gold. She wasn't reading sheet music, she was simply feeling. Her body swayed slightly as if she was dancing with the soundless rhythm only she could sense. Mrs. Carter leaned against the doorframe, her eyes soft with emotion. She didn't want to disturb the girl, so she just watched. Every movement Lila made carried meaning, gentle, patient, honest. It wasn't just practice. It was a kind of magic that couldn't be taught. After a few minutes, Lila stopped playing and opened her eyes. She turned suddenly, startled to see Mrs. Carter there. Her cheeks flushed pink and she quickly reached for her notebook. She scribbled, "Sorry, I didn't know you were here." Mrs. Carter smiled and walked closer. "You never have to apologize for playing something that beautiful," she said softly. Lila hesitated, then wrote again, "It's not perfect yet." Mrs. Carter sat beside her and said, "It doesn't have to be perfect. What matters is that it's real. And what you play is very real, Lila." For the first time, Lila looked truly proud of herself. She smiled wide, her eyes shining. She pointed at the piano and wrote, "It's my friend." Mrs. Carter nodded, her heart melting. "Then keep listening to your friend," she said gently. From that day onward, Mrs. Carter secretly supported Lila's extra practice. She left the classroom door unlocked after school and even placed fresh sheet music on the piano for her to explore. Lila studied each page carefully, tracing the notes with her finger, memorizing patterns and rhythms. But she didn't just rely on paper. She relied on the world around her, the way the sunlight flickered through the curtains, the way her heart beat when she pressed a key. Music for her wasn't about sound, it was about sensation. Meanwhile, Ethan had noticed her staying late. One day, out of curiosity, he peeked through the small glass window of the music room door. What he saw confused him. Lila was sitting barefoot at the piano again, her eyes closed, playing softly. Ethan frowned. "What's she even doing?" he whispered to himself. "She can't hear a thing." But as he watched longer, something inside him changed. Her expression wasn't blank or confused. It was full of emotion. Every note she played seemed to flow straight from her heart. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, guilt maybe, or admiration. But he quickly shook it off and walked away, pretending not to care. Lila didn't know he had seen her. She was lost in her world of silent music. Every day she improved. Her fingers became more confident. She began to recognize songs just by reading the notes and feeling how they should move. She taught herself timing by counting vibrations and watching the motion of her own hands. One afternoon while she played, she felt tears well up in her eyes. For the first time, she didn't feel like the deaf girl. She felt like a musician, a real one. She thought about the upcoming recital. Her stomach twisted with nerves, but deep down she was excited. She wanted to show everyone, especially Ethan, that music wasn't about hearing. It was about connection. That night when she went home, she told her mother by writing in her journal, "They laughed at me, but soon they'll understand." Her mother smiled gently, touching her hand. "They will," she signed back, "because your heart hears what others can't." Lila went to sleep with that thought in her mind. She dreamed of the piano, glowing under the stage lights, and herself sitting before it fearless and free. She didn't know it yet. But her silent practice would soon create a sound so powerful that even those who mocked her would feel it, just like she did. A week passed quickly, and the day of the music recital was getting closer. The classroom was full of excitement. Students practiced their pieces, talking about what songs they would perform. Mrs. Carter moved from desk to desk, helping, correcting, encouraging. The air was alive with sound. The tapping of keys, the thump of drums, the soft hum of violins being tuned. But in the middle of all that noise sat Lila, silent, calm, and focused. She was writing in her notebook, tracing the pattern of piano keys drawn by hand. Her lips moved slightly as she counted in her mind, memorizing when each note should come. She couldn't hear the sound, but she could feel the rhythm inside her. Ethan, sitting across the room, kept glancing at her. He still couldn't understand her. Everyone was talking about how brave she was for joining the recital, but part of him still doubted it. He thought she was sweet, sure, but how could she really play? That afternoon, Mrs. Carter clapped her hands. "All right, everyone. We'll do a small practice today. Who wants to go first?" Ethan's hand shot up immediately. "I will," he said with his usual confident smile. He walked to the piano and began playing one of his favorite songs, fast, impressive, loud. The students clapped along, and when he finished, they cheered. Ethan stood up and gave a little bow, enjoying every second of the attention. Then Mrs. Carter turned to Lila. "Would you like to try, dear?" she asked kindly. Lila froze. Her heart pounded hard in her chest. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Ethan folded his arms, waiting. He smirked slightly, remembering his own words from before. "Can you even play piano if you can't hear it?" Lila looked down at her notebook. Her hands trembled, but then she remembered what her mother had said. "Your heart hears what others can't." She took a deep breath and stood up. Slowly, she walked toward the piano. The class went silent. Even the air felt heavy. Lila sat down, ran her fingers lightly across the keys, and closed her eyes. She didn't play yet, she was listening in her own way. She placed her left hand on the wood beside the keys, feeling the cool surface under her palm. Then gently she pressed one note. The vibration was small but steady. She could feel it. Then another, and another. Soon her fingers moved in rhythm, creating a simple melody. To the class it was slow, maybe even imperfect. But to Lila it was alive. Every note traveled through her hands, her feet, her whole body. She swayed slightly, her hair falling over her face as she played. When she finished, the room stayed silent. For a long moment no one said anything. Then Sarah, one of the girls who had laughed before, began to clap softly. The others joined in, unsure but touched. Ethan didn't clap. He just stared at her, confused. Something about what she'd done bothered him, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him think. He had played the piano for years, but he had never played like that, with such feeling. After class, when everyone was leaving, Ethan stayed behind. He leaned against the piano as Lila packed her things. "Hey," he said suddenly. She turned and looked at him, waiting. It wasn't bad, he said awkwardly, scratching his neck. But I don't get it. How do you know what you're playing if you can't? Here? Lila opened her notebook and wrote slowly. I don't hear music. I feel it. I don't hear music. I feel it. Ethan frowned. Feel it like, with your hands? She nodded and tapped her chest and right above her heart. Then she smiled softly and added another line. And here. Ethan didn't know what to say. He just stood there for a moment staring at her. Something inside him, the part that had laughed at her, started to crumble. The next day, Mrs. Carter made an announcement. For the recital, I want everyone to choose one special song, something that means something to you. Play it not just with skill, but with heart. When class ended, Ethan approached Lila again. Hey, he said, trying to sound casual. What song are you going to play? Lila wrote, I don't know yet. I'll feel it first. Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. You're really something, he said. You know what? Let's make a deal. If you play something good at the recital, I'll admit I was wrong. Lila smiled, not offended. She nodded and wrote, and if I don't, you can teach me. Ethan grinned. Deal. As the week went on, Lila practiced harder than ever. Every afternoon, she sat in the music room, eyes closed, learning the rhythm of the songs through the vibrations. Mrs. Carter secretly watched her progress, amazed. The girl had a gift, not because she could play, but because she understood. Ethan sometimes passed by the window and saw her playing. For the first time, he didn't laugh. He watched quietly, trying to understand how someone could make music out of silence. One evening, he went home and sat at his own piano. He played his usual song, but this time he closed his eyes. He tried to imagine what Lila felt when she played. The vibration, the heartbeat, the emotion. And for the first time in his life, he felt something new, something real. The recital was now only a few days away. The posters were up, the students were nervous, and the entire school was buzzing with excitement. But for Lila, it wasn't about showing off or winning applause. It was about one thing only, sharing what silence had taught her. And though she didn't know it yet, that simple challenge, that playful bet, was about to change both her life and Ethan's forever. The big day had finally arrived. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement. Rows of chairs were filled with students, teachers, and parents. The smell of polished wood and fresh flowers filled the air. Colorful lights glowed softly across the stage, where a grand piano stood under a single spotlight. Backstage, students whispered nervously, clutching their instruments and music sheets. Some were fixing their clothes, others quietly humming their songs. Among them sat Lila, calm but with her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Her heart was beating fast, not from fear but from emotion. Mrs. Carter knelt beside her. Are you ready, sweetheart? She asked gently. Lila nodded and wrote on her notepad. I'm ready to feel it. Mrs. Carter smiled warmly. That's all that matters. Then the program began. One by one, students went on stage. The violinist, the drummer, the guitarist, each receiving cheers and applause. Finally, it was Ethan's turn. He walked on stage confidently, adjusting his tie. The audience whispered. Everyone knew he was the star of the class. Ethan sat down, cracked his knuckles, and started playing a fast, powerful tune. His fingers moved like lightning, every note clear and sharp. The sound filled the hall. Parents nodded proudly. When he finished, the crowd clapped loudly. Ethan stood, smiled, and bowed. But as he turned toward the backstage curtain, his eyes caught Lila's for a moment. She gave him a small smile, calm, steady, fearless. Ethan nodded slightly, not in mockery this time, but in respect. Mrs. Carter stepped forward and spoke into the microphone. And now we have a very special performance from someone who reminds us that music isn't only something we hear, but something we feel. She smiled at Lila. Please welcome Lila. The room grew quiet. The air felt heavy. As Lila walked slowly to the piano, every eye followed her. Some students looked curious. Others looked doubtful. A few whispered softly, "She's the deaf girl." But Lila didn't look at anyone. Her steps were steady. Her small shoes clicked softly against the wooden floor as she walked toward the piano. She reached it, placed her notebook aside, and sat down. She took a deep breath. The bright stage lights made her skin glow. Her hands hovered over the keys. She closed her eyes. The world disappeared, At first she didn't move. The audience sat in complete silence. Then softly she began. The first notes of Moonlight Sonata filled the air, slow, emotional, hauntingly beautiful. Her fingers moved with care and grace, pressing each key with love. She wasn't reading notes. She was remembering the way each vibration felt under her fingers when she practiced alone in the quiet room. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. Her lips parted just a little, as if whispering to the piano. The sound was gentle but deep, reaching the hearts of everyone in the audience. Mrs. Carter felt tears rise in her eyes. The other teachers leaned forward, moved by what they saw. Even the students who had laughed before sat frozen, their smiles fading into awe. And then something magical happened. The lights above flickered slightly, making the piano shine. Lila pressed a low note, the vibration so deep that the stage floor itself seemed to hum. She felt it in her chest, through her bones, through her soul. Her face softened with emotion. It was as if the piano was telling her story. All the pain, all the silence, all the hope. The room was filled not just with sound, but with feeling. When the final note came, it hung in the air like a breath that no one wanted to end. Lila's fingers rested on the keys for a moment longer. Then she slowly lifted them, opened her eyes, and looked out at the crowd. The audience sat in stunned silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then one person began clapping. It was Ethan. He stood up and clapped hard, his eyes wide, a smile slowly spreading across his face. The rest of the audience followed. Soon the whole room erupted in applause, loud, long, endless. People stood up cheering, some even wiping tears. Lila couldn't hear any of it, but she felt it. The vibrations of hundreds of hands clapping echoed through the floor, up the piano, into her feet and body. Her eyes filled with tears. For the first time, she truly felt the sound of love. Mrs. Carter hurried on stage, tears streaming down her face, and wrapped her arms around Lila. "You did it, my dear," she whispered. "You made us all feel music." Lila smiled through her tears and wrote quickly in her notebook. "I didn't play the piano. The piano played with me." The audience laughed softly, touched by her words. Ethan came up to her, looking embarrassed but amazed. "Hey," he said quietly. "You were incredible. I don't even know how you did that." Lila smiled and wrote one line. "You don't need to hear music to understand it. You just need a heart." Ethan nodded slowly, speechless. He looked at the piano, then back at her, realizing that everything he thought he knew about music had changed. That night, as Lila stood outside the school under the cool sky, she closed her eyes again. The world was silent, but her heart was loud with emotion. She could still feel the music from the stage, the applause, the vibrations, the warmth. For her, it wasn't just a performance. It was freedom. The applause still echoed in the air long after Lila left the stage. Even though she couldn't hear it, she could feel it deep inside her chest, strong, alive, like a heartbeat that wasn't hers alone anymore, but belonged to everyone in the room. Backstage, she sat on a small wooden chair, breathing slowly, her fingers still trembling from the performance. Her mother rushed in, her eyes shining with pride. She hugged Lila tightly. "You were wonderful," she said, knowing Lila couldn't hear the words but could feel the love in her arms. Mrs. Carter joined them, wiping tears from her face. "You showed everyone what music truly means," she said gently, signing the words so Lila could understand. Lila smiled, her eyes glowing with quiet happiness. She didn't need to hear praise. The feeling in the room was enough. Warm, full of energy, full of something she had never experienced before. Understanding. Out in the hall, the audience was still talking. Some were wiping their eyes, others whispering to each other in amazement. "She's deaf?" a parent asked in disbelief. "Yes," Mrs. Carter said proudly. "She can't hear sound, but she feels it through vibration." "She taught herself how to play that way," the crowd murmured in awe. A few students who had once giggled about her now stood quietly, their faces red with guilt. They didn't know what to say. Then Ethan stepped forward. He walked to the microphone on stage, looking nervous for the first time that night. The noise in the hall slowly faded as people turned to see what he was doing. He looked around, then spoke clearly. "Before Lila's performance, I used to think music was only about sound. About being perfect. Fast fingers, loud notes, applause." He paused, looking down at the piano. "But today I realized I was wrong." The crowd stayed silent. Mrs. Carter watched from backstage, her hand covering her mouth in emotion. Ethan turned toward where Lila stood behind the curtain. "Lila," he said, his voice soft but steady, "you showed us something I'll never forget. You played with your heart, and you made me feel music for the first time." Gasps and soft murmurs filled the air. Lila's eyes widened. She looked at Mrs. Carter, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, she walked back onto the stage. The audience clapped again, not out of habit this time, but out of pure admiration. Ethan smiled awkwardly, his cheeks pink. "I'm sorry," he said gently, speaking slowly so she could read his lips. "I was wrong to doubt you," so she could read his lips. "I was wrong to doubt you." Lila blinked, surprised, then smiled. She opened her notebook and wrote carefully, her hand steady now. "You weren't wrong. You just didn't know how to listen yet." The audience laughed softly, touched by her kindness. She turned to Mrs. Carter and wrote another line. "Can I show them something?" Mrs. Carter nodded, giving her the microphone. Lila held it for a moment, unsure. She couldn't hear her own voice, but she had practiced speaking words softly at home. She wanted to try, for this moment. She took a breath, her lips trembling slightly, and said slowly, "Music is not what you hear." Her voice was quiet but clear. "It's what you feel." The hall went completely silent. Not a whisper, not a sound. Everyone just watched her, eyes wide, hearts full. Then the applause started again, louder than before. People stood up, clapping, cheering, crying. Some students rushed forward, wanting to hug her, but she simply bowed her head with a peaceful smile. Mrs. Carter hugged her tightly. "You changed them," she whispered. "You changed all of us." Later that evening, when the show was over, Ethan found Lila sitting alone on the stage, touching the piano gently. He walked over and sat beside her. The stage lights were dim now and the seats were empty. "Hey," he said softly. "You know, I used to play this thing every day and I thought I knew everything about it. But after watching you, I think I've been deaf in my own way." Lila tilted her head, curious. Ethan smiled sadly. "I mean, I could hear music, but I never felt it. Not like you do." She smiled and wrote, "Maybe now you will." Ethan nodded.
"Can you show me?"
Lila placed his hand gently on the wooden part of the piano. Then she pressed one deep note. Ethan felt the vibration travel through the wood into his fingers. It was soft but powerful, like a pulse. "Do you feel it?" she wrote. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." Lila smiled and wrote again. "That's music. Not in your ears, in your heart." For a long time they just sat there, a boy who once mocked and a girl who had forgiven. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Outside, the night was calm. The moonlight streamed through the windows, casting soft patterns on the floor. Lila looked up at the glowing sky and smiled. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like the deaf girl. She felt seen. The revelation wasn't about proving she could play. It was about showing that music, love, and courage don't need sound. They only need a heart willing to listen. And that night, everyone in that small school, students, teachers, parents, went home hearing a kind of music they would never forget. The next morning, the school felt different. The hallway that once echoed with whispers about the deaf girl now buzzed with smiles and admiration. Everywhere Lila went, people looked at her, not with pity but with respect. Some students even stopped to wave or sign good morning with their hands, something they had learned just to greet her. Lila smiled shyly, her notebook tucked under her arm. For the first time since she joined the school, she didn't walk with her head down. Her steps were light, her eyes bright. When she entered the music room, she saw a surprise waiting for her. On the blackboard, written in big colorful letters, were the words, "Thank you, Lila, for teaching us to feel music." Her heart swelled with joy. She turned toward Mrs. Carter, who was standing near the piano with a proud smile. "You deserve it," Mrs. Carter said gently, signing the words with her hands. Lila nodded, her eyes misty. She looked around the room. The same faces that once laughed at her were now smiling kindly. Sarah came up first and handed her a small folded paper. Inside was a note that said, "You're amazing. I cried when you played." Then Tom, the drummer, gave her a small pair of wooden drumsticks. "For you," he said awkwardly, "so you can feel the beat even better next time." Lila laughed silently and thanked him by bowing slightly. She didn't need to speak. Her smile said everything. Then Ethan walked in. He was carrying his piano book, but today he looked different, softer, quieter. When he saw Lila, he smiled. "Hey," he said. "Everyone's talking about you." Lila laughed, writing quickly in her notebook. "Good things, I hope?" "Only good things," Ethan said with a grin. Then he added, "You really changed something, you know. Not just the class, and me too." Lila tilted her head, curious. Ethan sighed. "I used to think music was about being the best. Playing fast, sounding perfect. But when I watched you, it felt different. It wasn't just music. It was like," he paused, struggling for the right word, "like a story without words." Lila smiled and wrote, "That's what real music is." From that day on, things began to change, slowly, but beautifully. Ethan started staying after class with Lila. They would sit at the piano together, side by side. Sometimes he'd play a piece while she placed her hand on the piano to feel it. Other times she'd play, and he'd close his eyes to imagine how it must feel to her. It became their quiet language, one that needed no sound. Mrs. Carter often watched them from her desk, smiling. She had never seen such a strong bond form through music before. It wasn't teacher and student or even friends, it was something deeper. They were learning from each other in ways that couldn't be written in any book. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the windows, Ethan asked her, "Do you ever wish you could hear?" Lila stopped playing for a moment. Her hands rested on the keys. Then she wrote slowly sometimes. "But then I remember, I can feel more than most people can hear." Ethan read it and a small smile formed on his lips. "That's actually kind of amazing," he said. Lila shrugged and wrote teasingly, "I told you your ears aren't the only way to listen." He laughed. "Guess I needed you to remind me." From then on, Ethan changed the way he played. His music became gentler, more emotional. During class, when he performed, everyone noticed. It wasn't just notes anymore, it had feeling. And every time he finished playing, he would glance at Lila, as if thanking her silently. The other students were inspired too. Sarah tried playing the violin barefoot once, saying she wanted to feel the sound. Tom learned how to tap out rhythms softly so Lila could sense the beat through vibrations. Even the quietest kids in class started expressing themselves more freely. Not afraid of making mistakes, just happy to create. One day, Mrs. Carter gathered everyone and said, "Do you see what Lila has done?" She reminded us all that music isn't just for the ears. It's for the soul. Everyone clapped and Lila blushed, hiding her smile behind her notebook. After class, Ethan came up to her again. "Hey," he said. "You know how we have the school concert next month?" Lila nodded, he grinned. "What if we play together?" Lila's eyes widened. She pointed at herself, surprised. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, you and me, a duet. I'll handle the melody and you can play the harmony. We can make something new, something that people can hear and feel." For a moment, Lila just stared at him. Then she smiled, a big, bright, joyful smile. She wrote quickly, "Deal. But we play it my way, barefoot." Ethan laughed out loud. "All right, barefoot it is." And so began their new journey. Two very different people learning to make one kind of music together. The classroom filled with laughter and warmth each afternoon as they practiced side by side. Sometimes they didn't even need the piano. They'd tap rhythms on the table or hum vibrations through their hands, turning silence into soundless songs. The mockery that had once separated them had turned into a friendship that connected hearts. Lila no longer felt alone, and Ethan no longer felt the need to show off. Together, they had discovered something purer, the kind of music that lives beyond notes, beyond sound, beyond words. And as they sat together at the piano that day, playing under the golden light, one truth became clear. Sometimes, the people who live in silence teach the world how to truly listen. The weeks passed quickly, and soon the day of the school concert arrived. The auditorium was brighter and bigger than the one they had used before. Rows of seats were already filled with students, parents, and teachers, all talking excitedly. The air buzzed with energy and the faint smell of flowers and stage paint. Backstage, Lila stood next to Ethan. Both wore white shirts and black pants for the duet. The piano on stage gleamed under the lights like it was waiting for them. Ethan looked calm on the outside, but his hands were shaking slightly. He smiled at Lila nervously. "You ready?" he asked. Lila nodded and wrote in her notebook with a playful grin. More than you? Ethan laughed softly. Yeah, probably. He took a deep breath and looked toward the stage curtain. You know, it's funny, he said quietly. A few months ago, I didn't even want to talk to you, and now, I can't imagine this without you. Lila smiled, touched by his words. She wrote, that's music. It brings people together. When their names were announced, Ethan and Lila performing The Sound of Feelings, the crowd cheered. The title itself made people curious. The two of them walked onto the stage together. The audience went silent. Mrs. Carter stood off to the side, her eyes glistening with pride. Ethan and Lila sat down at the piano, side by side. Lila slipped off her shoes and placed her bare feet on the floor. Ethan smiled when he saw it. Barefoot magic again, he whispered. Lila grinned and nodded. They took one last deep breath together, and then Ethan began. He played the first few notes, slow, soft, filled with warmth. Lila watched his hands carefully, waiting for the right moment. Then, as the vibrations reached her, she joined in, pressing the lower keys gently. The harmony that filled the air was unlike anything anyone had heard before. It wasn't just a song, it was a conversation. Ethan's melody spoke and Lila's harmony answered. Their hands moved in perfect rhythm, their expressions calm and full of emotion. The audience leaned forward, completely silent. The sound of the piano carried through the hall like a story, one of friendship, forgiveness, and courage. At one point, Ethan slowed down and whispered, "Your turn." Lila closed her eyes, feeling the vibrations of the last note fade through her body. Then she took over, playing softly, beautifully, letting her fingers glide over the keys as if the piano were breathing with her. The music rose and fell like waves. Ethan joined back in, matching her pace perfectly. Together they played the final part, a melody that spoke of two worlds coming together, of sound and silence finally meeting in peace. When they finished, the last note lingered in the air, long, gentle, alive. Lila held her hands on the keys for a moment, feeling the vibration fade, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. Then she looked up. The entire auditorium was still. And then, applause, thunderous, endless applause. People stood up, cheering and crying at the same time. Mrs. Carter clapped the loudest, tears streaming down her face. Parents wiped their eyes. Some even hugged each other, overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. Ethan stood up first, turning to Lila with a wide smile. "We did it," he said softly. Lila smiled back and wrote in her notebook, "No, we felt it." They bowed together as the crowd cheered. After the concert, reporters from the local paper came to interview them. One asked Ethan, "What was it like performing with someone who can't hear?" Ethan smiled and replied, "She may not hear with her ears, but she listens better than anyone I know." When they asked Lila what inspired her, she wrote a simple sentence on a card and held it up for everyone to read. "Music lives in every heart. You just have to feel it." The next day, their story spread around town. People talked about the deaf girl who played piano like a dream. The school even started a new music program for students with hearing challenges. Named the Lila Project, Ethan volunteered to help teach. He and Lila became known as the Heart Duo, and their friendship only grew stronger. They practiced together every week, not just to perform, but because music had become their shared language, one they didn't need words to speak. Months later, at the end-of-year ceremony, Lila received a small award from the school for reminding us that the truest sound comes from the heart. When she went up to the stage to accept it, the entire school stood and clapped again. She couldn't hear it, but she closed her eyes and felt the vibrations under her feet, steady and warm. After the ceremony, she sat at the piano one last time before the summer break. Ethan sat beside her. "Hey," he said softly, "what do you think music really is?" Lila smiled and wrote, "It's the voice of things you can't say but can feel." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes shining. "Yeah," he whispered, "and you helped me hear that." Together they pressed one soft note, a single sound that filled the quiet room. They didn't need applause this time. They just smiled, letting the moment stay. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled through the windows, wrapping them both in golden light. The piano stood between them, the same piano that once divided a mocking boy and a deaf girl, now uniting them forever through something more powerful than sound. And as Lila looked out at the bright world beyond the window, she knew one thing for sure. Even in silence, her music would never stop. Music would never stop.